Today is October the 19th. We're at Carroll Lutheran Village. We're interviewing Dahl Drenning.
Right.
And we're at the Carroll Lutheran Village, and we thank the people here for letting us use their facilities. Good afternoon, Dahl.
Well, good afternoon, John. Good to be with you.
To start the interview off, could you tell us how you got involved with Carroll County?
I came to Carroll County in January of 1967. I came to the county as a teacher. I was fresh out of the University of Maryland and applied for a mid-year position, and it so happened there was a social studies position open at Westminster High School, and I came up and interviewed with Mr. Steve Lerda, who was the principal at the time, and I think also with John Wooden, who was at the Board of Education office. And it was a Saturday morning interview, and they were, I think, desperate to have somebody in the position for the second semester. And the interview must have gone well enough, and I was offered the position, and I took it immediately, and then moved to Westminster early in January of 1967, and began teaching at Westminster High School, and taught until June of 1971 when I left Carroll County to go to graduate school. And then I resumed teaching in Frederick County for the rest of my career, and returned to Carroll County about 2003, first as a seminary student, and I was assigned here to Carroll Lutheran Village for my teaching parish assignment at Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary. And then in 2006, I came on as part-time as associate chaplain here at the village, and I've been here since.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a little town of Woodsboro in Frederick County. Okay. Not that far away, but I have to tell you that up until the time I interviewed here, I probably hadn't been to Westminster twice in my life before that. I would tell you that Westminster was a great place for a young teacher, at least for me. I probably would not have been comfortable in a suburban or urban setting, but I probably wanted something a little larger than the community in which I grew up. And Westminster was just that kind of a place. It was just a good place for me to be.
Teaching in Westminster, you must have a lot of stories a lot of experiences that are somewhat unique.
Well, I probably do, because it was a trying time in our history. I came in January of '67, and the very next year, 1968, there were a couple of assassinations. It was a time of racial unrest and certainly racial adjustment. It was the Vietnam War was becoming much more controversial during that period of time, and I was in the classroom. I was a social studies teacher. I taught American history, and then before I left, I taught sociology and economics, and of course they called problems of democracy in those days. And so we dealt with the current issues of the time, and it was somewhat of a difficult and unsettling time to be in the classroom and to try to inspire students to participate in the system, while the system seemed to be going in a lot of different directions at one time. It was a difficult time.
Did you find the students in Westminster different than in other places? For example, back in your hometown?
Well, to some extent, a little different, because there was a larger student population. I graduated in a high school class of 63 people, and as I recall, Westminster High School at the time I was there only had 3 grades. It had 10th, 11th, and 12th, because at that time there was still a junior high school, which was 7, 8, and 9. However, each class at Westminster High School had about 300 students. There were, as I recall, somewhere around 900 students in the school. And so those classes were much larger than the class that I was familiar with from high school. However, I'd come from a big campus at the University of Maryland, where the freshman class was a class of 4,000. Westminster High School had a great, and probably still does, had a great reputation at that time. It was a very solid school with a very stable faculty. There were very few turnovers from one year to the next, and many of the faculty had been there for quite a long time. And it was an excellent administration. It was a well-run school. I think the students and the community were very well served in that time, and I felt very comfortable and secure stepping into a faculty where that sort of stability and where a real mix of older, experienced teachers were there. And as a young teacher, I found it very helpful.
How did you find the community? You said you moved into the Westminster area shortly after taking the job.
I did. I found it very welcoming and open, and enough that I didn't feel at all constricted by, in terms of a social life. It was, as a teacher, I felt I had an obligation to conduct myself in a dignified and responsible way, but at the same time, I never felt folks were looking over our shoulder as such. The community was very welcoming. I started attending Grace Lutheran Church at that time, and stopped there on my first day in Westminster because I recognized the pastor's name. And I knocked on the door, and he invited me in, and we had a conversation. And before I left that day, he found me an apartment. He got on the phone and called a local landlord. And before I left Westminster that day, I had a place to live and felt very comfortable in coming into the community. Made a lot of good friends in the time I was there. Even as a young person, a relatively young person, in my 20s, I met a lot of older folks who were very kind, very generous, and very hospitable.
Yeah, I assume then that you became a parishioner of Grace Lutheran. And
I actually became an attender there. I don't think I ever changed my membership, but I was there. In fact, my wife and I were married at Grace in July of 1971, and then we moved out of the area and on to graduate school.
And in graduate school, I believe you said you went to the seminary?
Well, I did. That was lately. Okay. When I left Westminster, I went to Western Kentucky University and worked on a master's in education, and then went back to Frederick County and taught for 30 years, or 25 or 30 years over there. And then I went to seminary rather late in life. So, a story I'd like to share with you related to my time at Westminster High School. Again, I said this was a difficult time in terms of race relations and other issues, but I really wanted to reflect on the work of one faculty member at Westminster High School who I think did a tremendous amount of good in easing the transition in terms of race relations. It was my understanding that Carroll County the school system had not been racially integrated too long before I came. I want to say at least within 10 years of my arrival in 1967, and maybe even less than that. So there still were some adjustments taking place in the community. And again, with racial issues being what they were across the country. The person I want to reflect upon was the director of vocal music at Westminster High School, Mr. Herb Sell, and he's certainly well known to many folks in Carroll County. And the moment that I'd like to reflect upon was a concert that he sponsored and promoted probably in the spring of 1970. Herb was and is, as far as I know, a great fan of jazz music, and he was reflected that in his teaching. And that spring he booked the Duke Ellington Band to come to Westminster High School for a public concert. Now, Duke Ellington was toward the end of his life, but he still was still very active. And as I recall, the concert was in the middle of the week. It might have been on a Wednesday or Thursday evening, which I suspect was probably a little lower price to pay than on a Friday or Saturday night, the typical weekend engagement. Anyway, Herb had that spring had the choir singing Duke Ellington compositions, and he was teaching Ellington as a great American composer and performer. So the evening was, the auditorium was sold out. There wasn't, I think there was standing room only, as I recall. And the band came in and did the first part of their program, played all of the Ellington standards. And then at intermission, Herb had the chorus come out into the auditorium, and Duke Ellington came down and conducted the Westminster High School chorus,
Oh, wow.
singing his music.
That had to be exciting.
It was tremendously exciting. And the only thing that topped it was what happened at the very end of the concert. And this I've never forgotten. The previous year, if I have this correct, Herb had done an all Gershwin program. And one of the featured numbers, and this would have been in 1969, one of the featured numbers was Summertime from, I think I have this right, from Porgy and Bess. And there was a young woman, and I wish I could recall her name, a young woman who sang it in that spring 1969 program, and she was marvelous, just a very talented person. And at the conclusion of the Ellington concert, someone suggested, and I'm not sure exactly how this all came about, but this young woman was in attendance, and they said, "Duke, would you let her sing with the band?" And they literally sort of pushed her out on the stage and handed her a microphone and said, "What do you want to sing?" And she said, "I want to sing Summertime." One of the band members said, "What key?" And I don't think that was known. And finally he said, "Just start it." And she took the microphone and began to sing Summertime, and the band picked up the key behind her and played it, and from, by ear, obviously. And she literally brought the house down. It was one of those electric or electrifying kind of moments that spontaneous, obviously, had not been planned, or if it had been planned, it hadn't been shared with anybody. And she was a Westminster High graduate, had a beautiful voice, obviously a local talent. And I have felt through the years, because I've had a lot of years to think about it, I suspect that, and subsequent to that, Herb did some other things. He brought in a very well-known gospel performer and composer by the name of Jester Hairston. And Jester also was an African-American, and he was here at least twice, I think. But what I want to emphasize was, in a very subtle, but I think obvious to me at least, in a very subtle way, what Herb Sell did as a teacher for race relations in the Westminster community. We were there, probably certainly an integrated audience that night, but probably more white than not. And what Herb did was bring the African-American culture and tradition and heritage together in a town that was still growing, still adjusting to the realities of integration. And I don't know that he would have thought of himself as a crusader. I don't know that he would have thought of himself as a civil rights activist, but he probably did as much for race relations on that particular night, and I think for a generation of students, as anything that I may have taught in a classroom or any of the rest of us could possibly have taught in an academic setting. It was a very, very special moment.
I was just wondering, after that very special occasion, in your role as a teacher, especially in social sciences, did you notice a difference in the student body and in class reaction?
I don't know that I did specifically, but it certainly helped the atmosphere, because we were all trying to do the best we could to help folks make the adjustments at that time. And of course, it spoke volumes in terms of a witness to how folks needed to get along and could possibly get along and could appreciate the diversity and of our respective background and culture. It was just a marvelous evening.
It certainly was a wonderful evening. Do you have another story or an experience that made such an impression on you and on your student body?
I probably don't, and trying to think offhand of something, but I just had a real appreciation for the students. I still see In fact, now one of my supervisors is a former student, and that's a really unique experience, and one that I cherish, actually. I've been able to come back into Carroll County here since 2003, and run into people. It's sort of full circle. Folks that I knew in the past have sort of come back into my life in one way or another, and it's very gratifying. This was a great place for a young teacher to work. I got a tremendous amount of support from as I said, from the faculty, a tremendous amount of support from the administration. They had a vested interest in my success, and I knew it from the very first day, and I appreciated it. And long after I left Carroll County, I realized what a solid footing it was to begin a teaching career. In terms of one of the other great experiences I had personally was that I was the varsity soccer coach at Westminster High School in 1970 and 71, and we had a great experience. We had a very successful program in 2 years. The second year probably more successful than the first, and in that season, in the first 5 games, we were unscored on and undefeated. We did have a 0-0 tie.
Wow,
and
that's impressive.
It was, and it was the hard work of the kids and a combination of elements, and we just had a lot of excitement and the kind of experiences that you have with young people that I certainly have remembered from to this day. I can still recall certain games where we were very successful and weren't necessarily predicted that we would have been, and those are always the sweetest. Kids, really, the students, and many of them that I have stayed in touch with are very successful adults, have gone on to live good lives and to be successful in whatever pursuit. The athletics at that point really is a vehicle. It's not an end in itself. It's an experience that you hope that develops character and the kind of traits that will help you be successful in the rest of your life. And it's been my sense that was accomplished based on the interaction I have with some of those former students at this point in time. But it was exciting too. I was a young coach who had not had a lot of background, and I did try to keep it simple and have us in good condition and play a simple game, but try to execute as well as we could, and we were successful in the process.
I would imagine at that time Westminster High had maybe a disproportionate number of students who came from a farm background. I can't say. Certainly some, because I remember visiting some students, out in the country. I used to tell them at the time, I had a picture up on the bulletin board in my room of a steer or a cow, and I said, a little caption, there are more of us in Carroll County than there are of you. And at that time, Carroll County still was a major farming area, and I guess it still is today. I don't know what the percentage of development is. It's probably not as high as we think it is. But in those days, probably the livestock census in Carroll County was there were probably more cows than there were people, if you counted all of the dairy operations and the beef operations and that sort of thing. So I had an appreciation, and I wanted the students to appreciate the rural nature of the county and what it meant, and at the same time realize that it was beginning to change. How did you approach some of the social challenges at the time? Back, as you said, in the 60s, you had the Vietnam, you had the hippie generation. Yep. It was kind of the beginning of a looser society than maybe you and I grew up in.
I tried to, as a teacher here in Carroll County and elsewhere, I tried to remain objective in my teaching, and I never intended to indoctrinate students into a political view, one political view over another. What I did try to do was encourage them to participate in the democratic system that we had, and to understand the system and how important it was to be a voter, to be active in community affairs and to take some responsibility. But if not so much in Carroll, I don't know if I was here for a president. I guess I was for a presidential election, probably 1968. Students would ask me often how I voted. And I would tell them that I give them the same answer my father gave me when I was a kid, and I asked him the same question. He'd said, "We have a secret ballot in this country, and I don't have to tell you." And so I would inform the students that we had a secret ballot, and I didn't need to tell them. But I would often ask them, "Well, how many of you thought I voted for this candidate? And how many of you thought I voted for the other candidate?" And if the response was pretty evenly divided, I sort of thought that I'd done my job. That they didn't, they didn't know my politics necessarily, but I certainly encouraged them to be active and in the process and to whichever party, to develop a philosophy and then find a philosophy of what government should be and what it should do, and then find the party that best met their needs or best answered their.
It certainly is a great way to approach it. And
hopefully it worked.
Well, I really like the analogy of the 50-50 feeling. That was your benchmark.
Right.
If you had close to 50-50, that really worked.
Because students listen to what you say on a given day and think, well, he leans this way, or you lean the other way. So. Yeah. I have to tell you a great story of coming to Carroll County. When I agreed to come up to do the interview, which was probably in December of 1966, I guess, late in December. And I was just finishing up at College Park at the University of Maryland. And I had an apartment down there. I was living down there. So I needed to move my worldly possessions from College Park to Westminster. And so a friend and I borrowed a pickup truck from someone. And I got a map. And I said, well, look at this map. And we looked at Westminster and College Park. I said, here's Georgia Avenue. I said and it runs into Route 97. I said, it's a direct shot from down in Montgomery County to Westminster. And so we loaded up the truck with, a floor lamp and a chair and whatever else I had at the time, a bed. And up Georgia Avenue we go. Now, in 1967, there was a part or a piece of that route that turned into a dirt road.
Yes,
And further we went, we hit the dirt road, and the next thing we forded a stream. We actually ran through some stream, I think it's probably there in Howard County, somewhere near the railroad track. But my friend who was sharing the journey says, "Where in the world are we going?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "This looked like a direct route." And we laughed about that because it really was about as rural as it could possibly be.
Yeah, a little windy.
Right, until we finally came on up onto 97 and on into Westminster. Needless to say, I've been over that road a few times in recent years, and it's changed, but I've never forgotten the journey to Westminster to ford the stream to come to Carroll County.
Well, you came back to Carroll County a second time, this time instead of in a teaching position, but in a ministry position.
Exactly.
Could you share with us a little bit about how that came about?
Well, from a personal standpoint, I retired from teaching and then spent 4 interesting years working at Mount Vernon, George Washington's estate, as a livestock handler, and I got to as I say, dress up and play with somebody else's toys. I really got a chance to live the history, much of some of the history that I had taught. But I was commuting 140 miles a day, round trip to get there, 70 couple miles each way. And while I was there, I began to think about what I was going to do with the rest of my life, and being in relatively good health. And I had thought a few times earlier in my life about doing something for the church, doing something in ministry. And so I began to look more closely at that, and went through the process with the Delaware, Maryland Synod of the Lutheran Church, and enrolled as a full-time student at Gettysburg, Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg. And I did then, and my interest was with the aging. That was a specialized area as a diaconal minister, which is my call. And I thought, well, what a better place, because I had heard traditionally for years of Carroll Lutheran Village. And it was being a continuing care facility with folks living at various levels of care. I thought this is where I would like to and it was also connected to the church. This is where I would like to do ministry, or to at least get some training. And so I came here in 2003 as a student, just one day a week on Sundays, serving with Chaplain Jimmy Schwartz, who has been here for some time. And then the relationship was a good one, and I've continued on some part of that as a volunteer, and then to come back as an associate chaplain. And it's interesting that in the time I've been here, I've run into former students, I've run into former colleagues that I've taught with, students that I taught, and folks that I knew from the community years ago. And it's been a wonderful experience.
In your general experience, especially in the ministry experience, have you encountered, or do you know much about the history of the Lutheran Church in Carroll County?
A little bit, because it's certainly similar to that in Frederick and also in Washington County. Those three counties were heavily influenced by an influx of Pennsylvania Germans, of Germans who came from the Palatinate region of Germany and migrated into around Lancaster and York counties in Pennsylvania, and then very quickly took advantage in the 1730s, more like in the 1740s, took advantage of available land that the Calvert family made available to them in these western counties of Carroll, Frederick, and Washington County. And of course, at that time, Carroll and Frederick County were simply one county. And it's interesting, both counties have a very similar situation where they have probably about the same number of Lutheran churches, and 20 some odd churches that developed through the years, many of them well over 100 years old, many of them over 200 years old. And many of them were located or their location was based on sort of the farming communities that they served. And that, of course, has changed a little bit these days, whereas these churches sit out in rural areas, but the population has shifted a little bit, and their membership has changed. And some struggle, some are doing well, some are in place with the new arrivals of a more suburban development that are coming to them at this point. So I think they've had to redefine ministry in some aspects. But it's a very interesting and rich history in the German tradition. Many of them had maintained their records and their preaching in German for upward of 100 years. And somewhere in the 1820s or the 1830s, they began to do everything in English. The ministers they were calling weren't bilingual anymore. Some of the families began to change their names. Either they anglicized the German name, or they literally translated them whole cloth. My favorite example is a Frederick County family, the Easter Day family. In the early records, they were Ostertag, and I think that's probably true for in all of these areas, that you can find families that literally change their name. What is interesting to me, and a story related to my teaching that it reminds me of, because I did have an interest, and my own background, at least part of my family, was in that German Lutheran tradition. I would often ask students names of food, the old German names that had been passed down. Even though the language had died out, there were certain food types and varieties that folks remembered. And I would ask, and I could tell sort of what the rural makeup of the class was. One of the questions I would ask, I'd say, now I'm going to send you to the grocery store, and I want you to get me some Panhaus. And I say, how many of you know what you're going after? And hands would go up in those classes. And I knew very well that those kids were descendant of the German population. And we had an interest. And one of the other interesting stories related to the same German cultural background, I asked a student in a class at Westminster, and this was probably a sociology class because we were talking about culture and religion and such things. And I asked a student, I said, do you know who in this class knows what it means to try for fire? And a few hands went up. I said, "You do? What does that mean?" And most of the time it was a girl who would respond. Well, she said, "It means if you burn your hand or your arm, there's someone you can go to who will say something over the burn and blow on it and has something that they say, and it takes the pain away." And I said, "How many of you know about that?" And there were, in that particular class, and so long ago, but there were 3 or 4 kids who knew exactly what I was talking about. And I said, "How about finding out what it," and as one youngster said, "My grandmother does it." And I said, "Well, how about going home and finding out what it is she said?" So the kid came back. She says, "I can't tell you." She said, "That's a secret." She said, and I guess what we found out, in some families it passed from man to woman. In some families it went from woman to woman. But it was a Bible verse. It was some kind of a, I don't want to say an incantation, but it was some type of a Bible verse and something special that they said. Now that's a very old superstition that is passed down through the German culture. and I was amazed that kids in the 60s knew exactly what I was talking about.
It comes up. My background's very German too, and I did a book and did some research on the Woodbine area where I grew up, or where I live and have lived for the last 40-some years. And one of the history things I did was the Lutheran church in the area.
Right.
The original Woodbine church was Calvary Lutheran, and that was kind of, well, the Catholic tradition would call it a mission, but it was related to Messiah Lutheran, which in turn was founded by a group of people with Germanic names who came from the Taneytown area.
Right. You know, one of the things I've sort of discovered recently, because I'm currently serving as an interim at Trinity Deer Park. And Trinity Deer Park, the congregation there, was established in the 1860s, just right after the Civil War, by German-speaking people. And based on what I know about the history, that's kind of late. But what I think is that there were more recent immigrants that came into Carroll County after the early 18th century immigration from the 1740s and 50s, that there was more of a flow of immigrants later who were first generation Americans or even the immigrant generation, and were still obviously speaking and wanted pastors and services to be conducted, pastors to speak and services to be conducted in Germany.
The little bit of research I'd done in part of these interviews, we talked to a lady lived off Bachman Valley Road, and there's an old church, I believe it's the Church of the Brethren up there, and the tombstones were all in German up until the end of the Civil War.
Right. Well,
and that seemed to be the turning point in this area from the little bit.
And that may be a little later. My familiarity in Frederick County was that the changes took place, a little bit earlier. One of the interesting things is that culturally speaking, it certainly wasn't all Lutheran. You had the German Reformed tradition, and then you had various Anabaptist groups, the Brethren and others, all of them sharing a very similar culture, but a different theology and a different liturgical tradition. But all living together and in communities and having a great deal in common, I think.
Yeah. Do you have any other experiences you would like to share with us during this interview? I probably don't. I probably have said about all that I can recall. But again, I've truly been blessed to be able to spend the time that I have in Carroll County, and I've learned to appreciate the tradition here, and again, it's a very similar tradition to Frederick County and to Washington County for that matter. But I just am enjoying my time here at Carroll Lutheran Village and at Trinity at Deer Park, and glad that I was able to come back this way in my lifetime. Okay, well, I would like to thank you very much for this short interview. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And thank you very much. Well,